Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the funeral for Monica was assembled with a speed that felt almost indecent in contrast to the depth of the grief it sought to honor. And yet every movement within the Quartermain mansion conveyed reverence. Staff moved in measured silence through the main hall, rotating fresh white lilies into crystal vases and smoothing the black crepe that had been draped along the banister. The air held the layered scent of polish, beeswax, and cut flowers, while the hush of whispered logistics intertwined with the subdued tread of the funeral home attendants. Jason entered with the look of a man hollowed out by hours that would not end, his face drawn and colorless, his attention tethered to the framed portrait of his mother set within a glass pedestal. The absence that Monica had left behind seemed to dilate outward, room by room, until the house's familiar architecture felt rearranged around an infillable space, pressing memory and silence against the ribs of everyone who owed her some private debt of kindness or correction. In that widening stillness, Tracy stepped forward and took the burden of order. She accounted for seating and schedule, for clergy and carriage, for flowers and photographs and the pacing of the procession, insisting on a standard of dignity that matched the woman they were about to carry into the cold formality of ritual. Before the stream of mourners began, the house belonged to two people bound together by a complex inheritance of loyalty, competition, and reluctant unity. Jason and Tracy stood in rooms where their disagreements once ricocheted, only to discover how quickly adversaries can become allies when the fixed point in the middle vanishes. He carried the particular terror of a son who could not imagine the house without the voice that organized its mornings and repaired its nights, the fear of a corridor without the soft, decisive footfall that always seemed to arrive at the right moment. She scanned the artifacts that Monica's hands had arranged over decayed silver frames, old medical texts, an obstinate fern thriving in winter light, and felt the immovable weight of stewardship fall against her sternum. What had once been contested became obvious. The house remained the house because a life had kept it coherent. Briskness yielded to eulogy inside her, and the edges of her composure softened into an ache that needed duties to keep it from spilling over. By the time the first guests arrived, the garden had become an annex of the house's grief. A memorial table was set beneath the pale stretch of autumn sky hemmed with hedges and the dull gleam of wet stone. Monica's photograph rose at the center of a ring of lilies, and around it, a chronology unfolded in images, a young physician's alert gaze caught by a hospital corridor lens. Celebratory dinners cluttered with charts and champagne, candid summer frames in which sunburnt children raced beyond focus. The scene choreographed its own quiet. Coats were shrugged off and folded over arms rather than chairs, voices flattened to a low register meant to respect distance. And condolences found form in the pressure of palm to shoulder and the small nod that promises more words later. Jason stood near Tracy to receive those gestures, the rhythm of sympathy almost soothing until some detail, a characteristic knot in a tie, the familiar scratch of a signature on the guest ledger, tore at him without warning, forcing him to turn slightly away and fix his breathing. Inside, the mansion surrendered to ceremony. The staircase, draped in black, created a visual descent that mirrored the emotional one. Visitors slowed as they reached the landing so their eyes could adjust from sunlight to chandelier. Staff replaced candles before their flames guttered and tightened the ribbons on floral sprays that had begun to wilt at the margins. The living room became a gallery of intention, the piano closed and dusted, programs fanned on an antique tray, a stand prepared for the officiant's book, and a discreet table laid with handkerchiefs and water. Each object translated the abstract volume of loss into practical steps. Even the grandfather clock seemed to modulate its chime, as though aware that the passage of time had acquired a new, mournful weight. Jason moved as if gravity had grown heavier on this particular day. His grief did not depend on the clarity of childhood recollections but on the lived vocabulary of the present, a text that arrived at exactly the right moment. A glance across a room that halted an argument before it started, a question asked with diagnostic precision that exposed his evasions and offered sturdier ground. He touched the frame of the portrait only once, fingertips on glass, then retreated to the work of greeting and arranging, knowing that action would protect him from the undertow of memory. He was conscious of how many people in the room had relied on Monica in ways they did not fully understand until today, and he absorbed their gratitude and sorrow like rain soaking into a coat. Heavy at first, then simply part of what he wore. Tracy converted pain into protocol because that is how she had always sheltered the family from chaos. She cross-checked lists against new rivals, adjusted order of service pages to accommodate a late-reading cousin, and conferred in hushed tones with the funeral director about transitions that needed to be seamless. It would have been easy for her to default to sharpness, to enforce quiet with the same iron that once drove business and bloodline alike. But here she chose a gentler discipline. She knew that Monica's memorial had to feel like a continuum of the woman herself, efficient, exact, and somehow deeply human even when the stakes were highest. In this, Tracy found her purpose, to ensure that the choreography of farewell held together long enough for everyone present to lay down a piece of their weight. The memorial garden became the heart of the day once the procession formed. A path had been brushed clean of leaves and bordered by lanterns that would glow later with the early fall dusk. On the table, beside the photographs, lay a leather book for pages of remembrance, where hands paused to write sentences that shook midstream. Confessions of gratitude wrapped in small stories, a word of encouragement offered in a corridor, a late-night call returned after a difficult scan, a stern warning that a life could still be turned from a cliff. In this ledger, Monica's work became a chorus of specific mercies. The soundscape of the garden echoed with rustle of programs, a chair leg nudged deliberately back into line, the faintest creak of an old gate as another guest slipped in. At intervals, the wind carried the cool clean smell of the lawn, and the white petals stirred as if exhaling. Those gathered carried their own tapestries of memory. Colleagues saw the set of shoulders that meant the surgery would be long and decisive. Friends remembered weekend meals that miraculously accommodated last-minute add-ons, half the table in scrubs. Younger faces, once children sulking through adult conversations, brought their own children to be introduced to the legend behind the stories. The Quartermain name had entangled triumph with trouble for decades. But Monica had refused to let the family be defined by its loudest ruptures. She modeled a quieter architecture in which showing up, telling the truth, and applying skill were forms of love. That ethic moved among the guests like a secret that everyone knew, not because they had been told, but because they had been rescued by it. Within the house, the piano bench had been rearranged to hold a narrow arrangement of greenery and a folded shawl Monica favored in winter. Someone had set a stethoscope on the lid, not as a prop but as a relic placed by hands that understood what tools become after a lifetime of use. A photograph near it showed a young resident team clustered around a whiteboard. A later one captured a retirement gathering in which Monica looked like the one person in the room who had not retired from anything that mattered. The placement of these images formed a story arc that did not need captions: commitment rising to mastery, mastery pivoting into mentorship, and mentorship widening into community. As the hour called for formalities, guests took their seats. The efficient, chosen for their knowledge of the family's long weave of celebration and catastrophe, stood with natural stillness. The house's lighting dimmed by a fraction, enough to pull attention into the center. Programs fluttered closed. The first notes of a hymn rose without fanfare, reaching the stairwell, brushing the frames on the wall, mingling with the fragrance of lilies that had released more of themselves as the day warmed. Jason and Tracy occupied their places with the gravity of people who understood they were not just burying a loved one, but anchoring a household to a standard that grief must not be allowed to erode. The service moved by design rather than impulse. A reading established the ground of gratitude. A biographical tribute sketched achievements without exhausting them. Silence followed, a long and deliberate interval that let meaning rewrite itself inside each listener. The officiant spoke of vocation as a way of life rather than a job, of the integrity that holds its line when compromise would be easier, of the kind of love that acts at odd hours without witness. There were no embellishments because the facts sufficed: decades of care, a city's worth of stories, a family steadied in more storms than it could count. The cadence of the remarks aligned with the cadence of Monica's leaf clear, exact, braced against sentimentality yet warm from the core out. When the recessional began, the room exhaled. People rose and moved with the respectful choreography that grief teaches, yielding space, setting hands briefly on shoulders, guiding elderly friends along the aisle. The portrait remained, the lilies stilled, the impression of presence somehow stronger now that the formal words had settled. Back in the hall, staff adjusted candles and righted a chair left a few inches askew, preserving the integrity of the scene as though these small corrections could stand against the larger disorder of loss. On the garden path, sunlight shifted, turning the edges of black fabric to a muted sheen, like ink drying on thick paper. After the formalities, the house resumed its intimate work. Food appeared with modesty rather than abundance. Conversation sketched the thinnest outlines of memory without trying to command the room. Children were shepherded into a side parlor where quiet distractions had been prepared. Jason, steadied by the structure the day had provided, began to assemble a checklist in his head that had nothing to do with menus or flower rotations. It held items like safeguarding reputations, preserving records, protecting one another from the predations of chaos. He understood that mourning would eventually withdraw from public view and become as private and stubborn as breath, but for now, the collective shape of it helped him stand upright long enough to thank people whose names blurred at the edges. Tracy's presence remained the house's metronome. She absorbed new information as it arrived: late visitors, scheduling revisions, small crises that always find funerals, and dispatch solutions with the economy of someone who understands that elegance is measured by how little friction people feel. Yet beneath the competence lay a devotion that could no longer be disguised by briskness. Every instruction and adjustment was an act of homage. If Monica had been the physician who kept hearts beating in operating rooms, then this was the parallel work, keeping the extended heart of a family beating through a day designed to stop it. As evening edged in, the mansion's windows collected the fading light and stitched it into a tapestry of gold and gray. Candles shortened and grew domed at their centers. The black crepe on the banister formed a ribbon shadow, a visual reminder that absence had been formally acknowledged even if it could not yet be absorbed. The last guests paused in the doorway to look back toward the portrait. The quiet that followed their departure was the first honest quiet of the day, different from the practical hush of preparations and the collective hush of ceremony. It was the quiet that comes when a house listens for a familiar step that will not return and decides how to proceed anyway. Night closed around the Quartermain home, and the evidence of the day arranged itself into a final tableau, programs stacked neatly on a tray. A pen resting beside the remembrance book with a curve of ink still wet on the nib. A single lily petal cupped in the grain of the floor. Grief settled into its long shape, not yet softer but more defined. In the rooms Monica had curated for so many years, the architecture of care she built remained: legible habits of responsibility, the expectation of steadiness, the insistence that family is proven rather than presumed. Jason and Tracy, each in their own way, would continue translating those principles into decisions and routines, allowing the house to relearn itself under a different sky. The day had honored Monica with the solemn grammar she deserved. The days to come would honor her with the ongoing work she taught them to do. Tracy stepped forward on behalf of the family with the steadiness of someone who understood that grief, if not given a structure, would spill across the floorboards and drown the living. Her remembrance shaped itself not as ornament but as architecture. She laid out Monica's life in clean lines and durable materials, discipline as foundation, compassion as load-bearing column, courage as crossbeam. She spoke of a physician who refused to concede defeat when medicine's margins narrowed to a hairline, a leader who kept teams focused when alarms were shrieking, and a matriarch who did not mistake bloodline for absolution. In Tracy's telling, Monica's love never depended on the weather of the household. It expressed itself in acts completed, in facts made right, in errors owned and repaired. What Monica protected, she did so with reason sharpened by training, but that reason was directed by a heart that understood people at their most frightened and their most rash. The remembrance turned, gently but unmistakably, to the central ethic Monica left behind. Family is not a privilege granted by birth but a responsibility renewed in storms. A promise to stand fast when the horizon darkens and the map becomes useless. Around the garden, shoulders trembled as her words settled. Tears fell not because of heightened rhetoric, but because the picture she drew matched the memory in so many minds. For Jason, the cadence became a temporary scaffolding. Each sentence gave him one more rung to grip, helped him descend from shock into a grief that could eventually be carried without breaking him. Beyond the bounds of ceremony, Port Charles continued its subterranean flow of small negotiations and vigilant routines. In the hospital's fluorescent hum, days earlier, Britt had accepted a post so humble it could be mistaken for exile. Their intake desk offered no prestige, only the steady abrasion of crises entering the building on foot, on wheels, on stretchers. Britt took it without protest, not because she had surrendered, but because vantage sometimes matters more than rank. From that station she could see the system's bloodstream, the vital signs of a complex organism that prefers not to admit where it is weakest. Her brief skirmish with Elizabeth told her enough. Leadership had tightened its valves, auditors had lengthened their shadows, and the margin for procedural improvisation had narrowed to a knife's edge. A routine evaluation returned a result as destabilizing as any diagnosis: no clinical evidence of Huntington's. The absence of the disease did not erase years of dread, but it changed the meaning of those years. If fate had been misread, who had supplied the text? If error had been allowed to harden into policy, who had benefited from the calcification? The intake desk, with its endless forms and fixed-angle monitor, became a listening post. Bert began to trace the white noise for signal. Timestamps repeated when they should not. Credentials opened doors outside their authorized hours. Attachments arrived whose metadata was suspiciously blank, then vanished into archives that had been pruned to neatly. Order sets changed as hands hovered, signatures aligned across documents in ways that suggested choreography rather than coincidence. She mapped these anomalies to storylines she already knew: contentious cases with legal exposure, deaths that left uncomfortable questions, familial conflicts that spilled into clinical notes. The closer she looked, the more the pattern resolved. This was not random drift. This was pressure applied at precise joints so the whole could be guided without leaving fingerprints. The threads converged near a cluster of dates and names that touched, directly or by consequence, the Quartermain household during its most fragile hours. From the intake chair, Britt understood the ugliest truth about power in Port Charles: it rarely walks through the front door. It circulates through forms and flags, through the administrative arteries that define reality after the fact. Elsewhere in town, the ordinary efforts at repair continued because people require them, even as the city braced for fresh ruptures. Sonny assembled a cookout not as spectacle but as a practical ritual, a way to keep Joe braided into family fabric rather than drifting at its edges. Food and warmth were deployed like instruments of public health. Conversation began shallow by design and deepened only as trust accumulated. Dante found his footing beside Joe not through grand revelations but through a series of small acknowledgments that they shared more terrain than either had expected. At the Quartermain stables, Molly chose the minor risk of complicity to spare Cody the major crisis of confrontation, then balanced the ledger by owning her earlier lapse in generosity. Lulu, absorbing the magnetism that pulls the past into the present, coaxed Charlotte and Rocco through a lost pet search that doubled as a lesson in persistence. Even as she worked an option for a future visit that might stabilize a different kind of loss. These were the lifelines that keep a town from snapping: modest kindness, apologies rendered without spectacle, the slow stitching of frayed edges. Back at the memorial, the procession reached its center of gravity. The wind grazed the black ribbon on the bier and turned whispers into a softer kind of silence. Tracy took her place at Jason's side and anchored him with a hand on his arm, a physical metronome that kept the service from breaking its own tempo. The officiant moved through a sequence that respected both science and spirit, neither subordinated to the other. Because Monica had taught them that medicine and meaning do their best work when they collaborate, guests rose in turn to place a single flower or a folded memory on the table. The tokens created a scatterplot of gratitude, an internship saved, a diagnosis clarified, a boundary established that kept a life from tipping. Jason let his eyes move line by line through those messages. He knew the amnesia that walled off his earliest years would never thaw enough to give him everything he wished for. But the ledger of actions before him proved that a life can be understood through its effects. He recognized that love's durability does not depend on the luminosity of old images but on the present tense of promises kept. The moment that followed did not belong to sentiment. There was no overture, no dramatic flourish. Britt crossed the threshold of the garden with the stillness of someone who had decided, after considering every cost, that delay would only degrade what needed to be preserved. She had gathered the digital residue that people leave when they move too boldly in spaces they believe are under their control, axes logs stacked against schedules. Audit trails that did not match official narratives, documents revised at the precise points where liability begins to take shape. She had packaged these findings within a chain of custody that would withstand hostility and doubt. In her calculation, testing the integrity of the hospital's record was not an attack on a grieving family, but an act of allegiance to the standards Monica lived by. When a city's medical memory is corrupted, it is the dead who lose their clearest advocates and the living who inherit distortions. The authorities entered without showmanship, absorbing the tone of the day rather than imposing their own. Their voices remained low, their movements disturbed as little air as possible. The warrant, when it appeared, seemed to dim the color of the lilies. Shock traveled through the assembly like a pressure wave, soundless at first and then registering as a chorus of held breath. Drew found himself translated, in an instant, from guest to subject, from mourner to respondent. The circle around him did not close like a trap so much as crystallize like a truth that had been approaching for weeks. The language of due process, delivered precisely to avoid contamination of the moment, landed with the cold authority of winter. No one had anticipated accountability arriving at this velocity in this place, but the timing did not make the premise less necessary. If the town meant what it said about the rule of law, then the rule could not be made to wait for a more convenient day. Jason's expression shifted from rawness to a concentrated calm that did not deny the pain but organized it. He understood, instinctively if not yet exhaustively, that honoring Monica's legacy required to simultaneous loyalties, to memory and to method. It was not enough to guard a house, to keep a portrait free of dust, to maintain a garden in a state of perpetual readiness for gatherings that might never again feel whole. He would have to protect the truth where Monica had done her fiercest work in the disciplined environment of institutions that shape life and death, and the records by which future decisions are made. This would require him to stand in rooms he did not like, with people he did not trust, making arguments whose outcomes would not be guaranteed. It would demand that he extend generosity without naivete and scrutiny without vengeance. In that instant, the path forward stopped being abstract. It became a list he would carry, visible only to him but legible in his posture. What followed the rest was not a collapse but a reconfiguration. Conversations that could have detonated were absorbed into parallel channels, logistical on one side, legal on the other, so the service could be completed with the integrity it deserved. Tracy signaled to continue the order of tribute, refusing to let the day be stolen by a single, however seismic, event. She dispatched counsel to track every step of the process that had just begun while she kept the ritual moving. Not to minimize what had occurred but to prevent it from rewriting the narrative of a life being honored. Britt withdrew to the perimeter, accepting the hostility directed at her as a predictable reaction to disruption, prepared to answer in the only language that would matter now: procedure, provenance, proof. When the pallbearers lifted the weight that had changed everyone's sense of proportion, the garden fell quiet again. The procession advanced, lanterns catching the late light, and holding it steady long enough to suggest that steadiness was still possible. The house, relieved of its immediate duties, kept the evidence of devotion in orderly erased remembrance book inked with uneven lines, the program squared on a silver tray. The shawl draped over the piano bench as if a figure might return and claim it against the evening chill. Outside, petals loosened from their centers and took to the air like soft shorthand for what can never be kept entirely. Night gathered, and with it the long work began. Port Charles would awaken to headlines and rumors, and the increasingly loud machinery of process. Alliances would be tested, and some would fail. Others would be formed in the pressure of necessity. Jason would measure his days not in the distance from this one, but in the choices that either honored or eroded the ethic that Tracy had articulated and Monica had embodied. Tracy would continue to translate grief into tasks until tasks gave way to the quieter, harder labor of absence. Britt would carry her case into rooms where certainty is rare and outcomes are not improved by emphasis. In all these trajectories, the through line held: the only adequate memorial to a life built on rigor and mercy is rigor and mercy, practiced when they are least comfortable. That, more than any flower or speech, would keep the house standing when the wind shifted again. The consequences of that moment rippled out instantly. Clusters of guests formed small circles of discussion, trying to preserve the decorum of the funeral while confronting the fresh shock. Tracy insisted the rites continue so the final farewell could be completed, while delegating to the family's attorney the task of tracking every step of the legal process. Britt stepped back, absorbing the simmering anger and suspicious looks, but she was prepared to answer with procedure and proof. She understood some would say she chose the wrong time, yet in a system that had been bent so many times, the only acceptable time was the moment when the truth was ready to stand on its own. As the casket left the garden for its final resting place, Port Charles seemed to inhale as one. An era had closed, but the frayed seams between medicine, law, and family would still need to be stitched back together through hearings, through pages of records, through frank conversations. Jason followed in silence, arranging new tasks in his mind to protect his mother's honor, to keep the family at peace, and to let the system speak with evidence instead of rumor. Tracy walked with steady strides, eyes fixed forward as if reading a silent list of work that could not be postponed. Behind them, friends, colleagues, and relatives drifted along the petal-strewn path, carrying the day's central question: how to honor Monica not only with a ceremony, but by living honestly with the legacy she left. Night settled over the mansion as the candles guttered out, leaving the scent of wax mingled with fading flowers. In the study, Monica's photograph remained on the wooden shelf beside the old medical materials she once used to teach young physicians. Poor Charles would wake the next morning to headlines about an arrest executed in the middle of a funeral, to a flood of questions demanding answers, to relationships forced to redefine themselves in courtrooms and in conscience. But before all of that arrived, the final quiet of the day belonged to those who remained: a family, a hospital, a city agreeing that to keep Monica's memory from dimming, they had to choose the hardest thing: to place truth above every comfortable calculation. And that choice, more than any wreath, would be the most enduring tribute to carry her to rest.